They laughed at the single mom in the last row. Cheap clothes. Crying kids. Then both pilots collapsed. 178 people. No pilot. No hope. She stood up. Walked to the cockpit. Said 3 words, X-fighter pilot. Nobody laughed after that. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. It was a Sunday evening, August 9th, 2020. The kind of evening that felt tired before it even started. The kind of evening where the sky was turning a dull orange over Fort Lauderdale and the airport terminal was packed with people who all had somewhere better to be. Spirit Airlines Flight 623 was scheduled to depart at 6:45 in the evening, bound for Detroit. The aircraft was an Airbus A320. There were 178 passengers on board. Budget airline. Cheap seats. Everybody trying to save money wherever they could. Nobody wanted the last row. Row 31. Seats 31D, 31E, and 31F. Those 3 seats were the worst seats on the entire aircraft. They did not recline because they were pressed up against the rear back wall. They were right next to the bathroom, so every time the lavatory door opened, a wave of warm chemical-scented air drifted out. The engines were loud back there, a constant heavy roar that vibrated through the floor and up through the seat cushions. Nobody chose the last row. You ended up there because you had no other choice. A woman was sitting in seat 31F. The window seat. She had 2 small children with her. The boy, maybe 6 years old, was sitting in 31E beside her. The girl, maybe 4 years old, was sitting on the woman's lap because the woman had not been able to afford to buy a 3rd seat. The woman looked exhausted. She was maybe in her mid-30s. Latina. Petite, around 5 feet 5 inches tall. She had dark hair pulled back into a messy ponytail. She wore no makeup. There were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of too many nights with not enough sleep. She was wearing faded old navy jeans with a small stain on the left knee and a wrinkled Target t-shirt that had the words, "Coffee then Chaos," printed across the front in faded letters. On her feet she wore cheap flip-flops from Walmart. Everything about her said that she was a woman who spent money on other things and had nothing left over for herself. The 2 children were fussy. Tired and fussy the way only very young children can be when they have been traveling too long and have not eaten enough and are past the point where they can manage their feelings. The boy kept kicking the seat in front of him without quite seeming to realize he was doing it. The girl was crying in the soft hiccuping way of a child who has been crying on and off for a while and has nearly run out of energy for it. Her stuffed rabbit had fallen to the floor between the seats and she could not reach it. The woman was trying to manage everything at once. She reached down between the seats to retrieve the stuffed rabbit and held it out to her daughter. She put her hand gently on her son's knee to remind him to stop kicking. She spoke to both of them in a quiet, patient voice even though the patience was clearly costing her something. "Mijo, please stop kicking the seat," she said to the boy. "I know you're tired. We are almost done. We will be home soon." The boy looked up at her. "Mama, I'm hungry," he said. The woman nodded slowly. "I know, baby. We will eat when we land. I don't have money for the snacks on the plane right now. Just a little longer." She said it gently, without apology, with the calm matter-of-fact tone of a person who had explained this kind of limitation many times before and had made peace with it. The boy turned back toward the window. A moment later his foot drifted forward and bumped the seat ahead of him again. The passenger in seat 30E was a businessman. He was wearing an expensive suit and had wireless earphones in both ears. He turned around when the seat was kicked. He looked at the woman and then at the boy and then back at the woman. His expression was not kind. "Control your kid," he said. The woman's face flushed with color. "I'm sorry, sir. I am trying, try harder," he said, and turned back around. The woman pressed her lips together. She did not say anything else. She put her hand on the boy's knee again, and her eyes were bright for a moment, and then she blinked and the brightness was gone. She whispered to her son. "Please, Mijo. Please be good for Mama. Just for a little while." Her name was Maria Santos. She was 34 years old. She lived in Detroit with her 2 children. She worked 2 jobs. In the morning she worked a shift at the cafeteria of a hospital, serving food to hospital staff and patients' families, standing on her feet for hours in the steam and noise of a large kitchen. In the evening she cleaned office buildings, pushing a cart through empty carpeted hallways and emptying wastebaskets and wiping down desks in the dark. She did both jobs 6 days a week. She did not have much, but what she had, she earned every day with her hands and her feet and her back. She had flown to Florida because her mother had died. Her mother had been the person who helped her with the children when Maria was working her shifts. Her mother had been the person she could call when something went wrong. Her mother had helped her stay standing for the past several years, and now her mother was gone, and Maria had used the last of her small savings account to buy 2 Spirit Airlines tickets to come down to Florida for the funeral and then fly home. She had bought the last row seats because they were the cheapest. She had not bought a 3rd seat for her daughter because she could not afford it. She was wearing Target clearance clothes because she had not bought herself new clothes in over 2 years. Every dollar she made went to the children. To rent. To food. To daycare. There was nothing left for Maria. There was never anything left for Maria. What the businessman in seat 30E did not know, what the college girls in row 29 taking selfies and laughing to each other did not know, what not a single person on that packed Spirit Airlines flight knew, was that Maria Santos had not always been this woman in cheap clothes in the last row with 2 crying children and no money for snacks. 15 years ago, she had been someone else entirely. 15 years ago, Maria Santos had been Captain Maria Venom Santos of the United States Air Force. She had flown F-16 Fighting Falcons. Strike fighter aircraft. She had been one of the elite. She had been fast-tracked, noticed, marked early as someone who was going somewhere significant in the Air Force. She had earned her call sign the hard way, during her first deployment to Afghanistan in 2007. She had been 23 years old. She had been in theater for only 6 months. It was supposed to be a routine close air support mission. It was not routine. Taliban fighters had pinned down a Marine patrol in a valley and were pressing in from multiple directions. Maria's flight lead had taken ground fire and had to turn back to the base. Maria was suddenly alone in the sky above a desperate situation with Marines on the ground calling in fire support and the enemy closing in fast. She was 23 years old and had 6 months in theater, and every instinct she had been trained to have told her what to do. She took command of the situation. She got on the radio with the ground forces. She worked out, looked at, and then she acted. She delivered exactness munitions danger close to friendly positions, a move that required absolute exactness and absolute nerve, because if you were slightly wrong you killed the people you were trying to save. She was not slightly wrong. She held off the enemy fighters for 47 minutes, circling and striking and talking to the Marines below, until reinforcements arrived and the situation was made stable and everyone came home alive. When the Marines described her afterward, they said she had struck like venom. Fast. Precise. Deadly. The name stuck. She was venom from that day on. She logged 1,834 flight hours over her career. She flew 267 combat missions. She earned a Distinguished Flying Cross and 2 air medals. She earned a Purple Heart after taking shrapnel from a surface-to-air missile that exploded near her aircraft over Syria, close enough that pieces of it punched through the fuselage and one piece cut into her shoulder, and she flew the aircraft home anyway. She was being considered for squadron commander. She was one of the best F-16 pilots in the Air Force. And then she got pregnant. The father was another pilot. When she told him, he disappeared. He requested a transfer and put distance between them and made it clear that he was not going to be part of the picture. Maria had a choice. She could continue her career, which she loved, which she was exceptional at, which was the core of who she believed herself to be. Or she could have the child. She chose the child. She left the Air Force at 25 with an honorable discharge and no plan for what came next. What came next was hard. She had no civilian work history. She had no support system except her mother, who was also not wealthy. The economy was difficult. She took whatever work she could find, and she loved her son Miguel, and she kept moving. She had a second child, Isabella, years later from a relationship that did not last either. And now she was 34, working 2 minimum wage jobs, raising 2 children alone, flying Spirit Airlines in the last row because that was what she could afford. Venom was gone. Only Maria remained. Broke and exhausted and invisible. She had made peace with it. She told herself it was enough. But sitting in that last row with her children on a Sunday evening, coming home from her mother's funeral, it was very hard to feel like it was enough. 30 minutes into the flight, Isabella finally fell asleep on Maria's lap. Miguel had grown quiet and was looking out the window at the dark sky. Maria let her eyes close. Just for a minute. Just to rest them. She was so tired. She had been tired for so long that she could no longer remember what it felt like not to be tired. She let herself drift for just a few seconds, and it was almost peaceful, and then the girl in seat 29E turned around. The girl was maybe 19 or 20, and she was traveling with a friend, and they had been talking and laughing and taking pictures of themselves for most of the flight. She looked at Maria with an expression of open irritation. "Could you, control your kids?" she said. "They were so loud during boarding. Some of us are actually trying to relax." Her friend turned around too and made a small sound of agreement. Maria opened her eyes. Her face was calm. "I'm sorry," she said. "They're tired. We just came from my mother's funeral." The girl's expression did not soften. "Okay, that's kind of a lot of information we didn't ask for." Her friend giggled. "Right? If you can't afford a babysitter, maybe don't fly." They turned back around, still laughing softly to each other. Maria sat very still. She stared at the seat back in front of her. She pressed her lips together. The back of her throat ached. "Don't cry," she told herself. "Do not cry in front of the children." Miguel was looking up at her with big quiet eyes. "Mama," he said softly, "why are they mean?" Maria put her arm around him and pulled him against her side. "Some people just are, Mijo," she said. "It doesn't mean anything about us. We are fine." But her voice was very quiet when she said it, and the word fine did not feel like the right word, and she stared at the seat back in front of her and breathed slowly and did not cry. 1 hour into the flight. They were cruising at 36,000 feet somewhere over the state of Georgia. The cabin was relatively quiet. Most passengers had settled in. Isabella was deeply asleep on Maria's lap. Miguel had fallen asleep against Maria's shoulder, his weight warm and solid against her arm. Maria was dozing herself, finally, the tiredness of the day and the week pulling her under despite the engine noise and the occasional bump of bumps in the air. She was almost all the way asleep when it happened. The cabin chime sounded 3 times. Ding! 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 The seatbelt sign illuminated above every row. The PA system clicked on and the voice of the senior flight attendant came through, clipped and urgent. "Flight attendants, please be seated immediately." Not a routine announcement. Not the gentle reminder tone. This was different. This was the tone of something actually wrong. Maria's eyes opened completely. Her military training, dormant for years but never fully gone, registered the change in tone before her conscious mind had fully processed the words. Something is wrong. Something is actually wrong. In the cockpit, Captain Jeff Morrison was slumped forward over the control panel. He was 51 years old and had 16,000 flight hours, and he was completely unconscious. First Officer Lisa Park was 38 years old and had 7,200 flight hours, and she was on her feet, leaning over him, shaking his shoulder, saying his name. Captain. Captain Morrison. Jeff. He did not respond. She checked his pulse with 2 fingers against his neck. It was there, but it was weak and irregular. He had suffered some kind of medical event. A cardiac episode, possibly. A stroke. She did not know. She keyed the PA. This is your first officer speaking. Is there a physician on board? We have a medical emergency in the cockpit. If there is a doctor or medical professional on this flight, please identify yourself to a flight attendant immediately. A physician came forward within 2 minutes. He was a cardiologist traveling for a conference. He examined Captain Morrison quickly and looked up at Lisa Park with a serious expression. He's had a cardiac event, the doctor said. He needs emergency medical care. He cannot fly this aircraft. Lisa nodded. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her voice was steady. I can fly us, she said. I'll declare an emergency and divert to Atlanta. We're maybe 40 minutes out. Then she felt it. A tightening in her chest. Not anxiety. Something physical. Her vision swam for a moment, the instrument panel blurring and then coming back into focus. She blinked. Blinked again. The tightening in her chest grew stronger. She understood in that moment, with a cold clarity that was almost calm, that they had eaten the same pre-flight meal. The same food. If it had been bad, if there had been something in it, then whatever had taken down the captain was now taking down the first officer as well. She tried to reach for the radio. Her arm felt very heavy. Her fingers were not cooperating the way they should. She managed to key the frequency before her vision narrowed to a point and she slid sideways in her seat, and then she was unconscious too. Both pilots. Both of them. Unconscious. The A320 held its course on autopilot, steady and steady, 36,000 feet above Georgia, 178 people in the back of it having no idea that there was nobody at the controls. Robert Chen was the senior flight attendant. He was 44 years old and he had been doing this job for 19 years, and he had trained for emergencies of many kinds, but when he pushed open the cockpit door and saw both pilots slumped in their seats, his face went white. He stood in the cockpit doorway for 1 full second, processing what he was seeing. The aircraft was stable. Autopilot was active. The instruments were all reading normal. But autopilot could not land the aircraft. Autopilot could not talk to air traffic control. Autopilot could not make the decisions that the next 43 minutes were going to require. He picked up the PA handset. His voice was shaking. He could not make it stop shaking, so he spoke as clearly as he could through the shake. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Robert Chen, your senior flight attendant. We have an emergency situation on this flight. Both of our pilots are currently unable to move. I need to know immediately if there is anyone on board who has piloting experience. Commercial pilot, military pilot, private pilot, anyone with any flight experience at all. Please identify yourself to a flight attendant right now. I want to be very clear that this is not a drill. If you have flight experience of any kind, I need you to come forward immediately. The cabin went silent. The kind of silence that is not peaceful at all. Passengers looked at each other. Someone in the middle rows said, "Oh my God," loudly enough to be heard several rows away. Someone else started crying. The businessman in 30E pulled out his earphones and looked around with wide eyes. The college girls in row 29 had stopped laughing. Nobody moved. Nobody stood up. Robert waited. He stood in the aisle at the front of the cabin and waited and watched, and nobody moved. Then, from the very back of the aircraft, from the last row, from row 31, there was a voice. A woman's voice. Quiet. Almost unsure. I might be able to help. Everyone turned. The people who were close enough to see looked back toward the last row. The people who were not close enough craned their necks and tried to see over the seats. It was the woman. The woman in seat 31F. The single mother. The one in the wrinkled Target shirt and the cheap flip-flops with the two small children and the stain on her knee. The one they had laughed at. The one who had been asked to control her kids by the businessmen and mocked by the college girls for not having a babysitter. Her. Robert Chen moved quickly down the aisle toward her. He crouched down beside her seat so they were at eye level. "Ma'am," he said carefully. "Did you say you can help?" Maria looked at him. Her heart was beating very fast. Isabella was asleep on her lap. Miguel was asleep against her shoulder. She had a choice right now, right this second, and she knew it. "I have flight experience," she said. "Military experience. But it was a long time ago. I have my children here and she stopped. Robert was watching her with the focused attention of someone who needed information fast. She started again. "What do you need me to do?" The businessman in 30E had turned around in his seat to look at her. He took in the Target t-shirt and the flip-flops and the sleeping children, and his face arranged itself into an expression that was somewhere between shock and dislike. "Oh, this should be very good," he said loudly, looking around as if inviting others to share in his skepticism. "The lady who can't get her kid to stop kicking my seat is going to fly the plane." There were a few nervous laughs from nearby passengers. The college girls exchanged a look. Maria heard all of it. She felt the heat of it in her face and chest. But she looked at Robert Chen and waited. Robert looked at the businessman with an expression of pure focus and then looked back at Maria. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "what did you fly?" Maria took a slow breath. "I am an X-fighter pilot," she said. Her voice was calm and clear. F-16 Fighting Falcons. United States Air Force. I was a captain. I flew for 8 years. I have 1,834 flight hours. I flew 267 combat missions. My call sign was Venom. There was a silence in the nearby rows that was different from the panicked silence of a moment ago. This was the silence of people adjusting their understanding of a situation. The businessman's mouth was open. He did not say anything else. Robert Chen did not waste another second. "Can you fly this aircraft?" he asked. Maria said, "I have never flown an A320. But I know flight principles. I understand aircraft systems and emergency procedures. I can try." Robert stood up. "That is all I need," he said. "Come with me." Maria looked at her children. Isabella sleeping, warm and limp across her lap. Miguel pressed against her shoulder, his breath slow and even. She looked at them for a long moment. A woman across the aisle, somewhere in her early 60s with silver hair and a kind face, leaned over. "I will watch them," she said softly. "Go on. You go do what you need to do, honey. I will take care of them." Maria looked at her for one more second and then nodded. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was very quiet. She carefully shifted Isabella from her lap to the older woman's arms. She kissed Miguel on the top of his head. He stirred slightly. "Mijo," she whispered. "Stay with this nice woman. Mama has to go help the pilots. I will be right back." Miguel opened his eyes halfway. "Okay, Mama," he said, and closed them again. Maria got up. She straightened her wrinkled Target shirt. She looked down the aisle of the aircraft toward the front, where the cockpit door was visible. Then she walked. In her Walmart flip-flops, with her hair still in its messy ponytail, with the dark circles under her eyes and the stain on her knee and no makeup and no uniform and nothing that marked her as anything other than what she appeared to be, a tired broke single mother in clearance rack clothes. She walked and every passenger she passed turned to look at her. Some of them had faces that were afraid. Some of them had faces that were uncertain. The businessman in 30E was sitting very still, not looking at her, and his jaw was set in a way that might have been embarrassment. She stepped into the cockpit. She looked at both pilots. Captain Morrison in the left seat, slumped forward. First Officer Park in the right seat, slumped sideways. The doctor who had come forward was still there, monitoring their pulses. The instrument panel of the A320 spread out in front of her. It was not the cockpit of an F-16. It was a commercial airliner. 2 seats side by side, a glass cockpit with multiple screens, the center console between them dense with switches and controls. It was different. But the fundamental information was the same. Altitude. Airspeed. Heading. Attitude indicator. Vertical speed. The language was different but the logic underneath it was logic she knew in her bones. She sat down in the left seat. She put her hands on the side stick control and the throttle. She breathed. She reached for the radio. Atlanta Center, this is Spirit Airlines Flight 623. I need to declare an emergency. Both of our flight crew are unable to move. I am a passenger who has taken control of the aircraft. I am a former United States Air Force pilot. I need immediate assistance and emergency approach vectors to Atlanta Hartsfield. She released the transmit button. There was a pause on the frequency. Then a voice, carefully controlled but with a note of controlled shock underneath it, Spirit 623, did you say you are a passenger? Affirmative, Maria said. Former military pilot. Captain Maria Santos, United States Air Force, call sign Venom. I flew F-16s for 8 years. I have never flown an Airbus A320 but I understand aircraft systems and flight principles. I have 178 souls on board and I need help. What do you have for me? There was a pause. A longer pause. Then a different voice came on the frequency. This voice was calm the way a person who has spent their entire adult life flying military aircraft is calm, not the absence of tension but the management of it, the pushing down of it into something that sounds like stillness. Captain Santos, this is Colonel James Wright, United States Air Force retired. I am A320 type rated. I flew F-15s for 22 years before I retired and I have been patched into this frequency. I am going to help you fly this aircraft. You are going to be fine. I need you to tell me what you are currently seeing on your primary flight display. Maria looked at the screens. She read the numbers to him. Altitude. Speed. Heading. Attitude. He said, good. That is exactly right. Now here is what we are going to do. Over the next 38 minutes, Colonel Wright talked Maria through every system she needed. He explained the A320's fly-by-wire flight system, which was fundamentally different from the direct mechanical linkages of an F-16 but was logical once the underlying layout was explained. He walked her through the autopilot modes and how to verify what the aircraft was doing on its own and what she would need to do manually. He gave her the landing speed calculations for the runway weight and configuration. He talked her through configuring the flaps and the landing gear, through the approach profile, through the decision altitudes. He was careful and steady and patient and completely steady, and Maria listened with the same total focused attention that had kept her alive and kept Marines alive over Afghanistan and Syria and Iraq. Her military training, which she had believed was 15 years gone, was not gone at all. It had simply been waiting. Her hands on the controls were steady. She was calm. She asked clear questions when she needed to. She executed each instruction precisely. Back in the cabin, the passengers knew enough to be afraid. Robert Chen moved through the rows and told them, as calmly as he could, that a passenger pilot was flying the aircraft with the assistance of air traffic control and a retired Air Force colonel. He told them to stay seated and to keep their belts fastened. The businessman in 30E was gripping the armrests of his seat so hard his knuckles had gone white. His face was the color of paste. "We are going to crash," he said, to no one in particular. "She doesn't know what she's doing. She's going to get us all killed." He said it several times, quietly, as if saying it was the only thing he had left. The college girls in row 29 were not laughing now. They were holding hands across the armrest and one of them was crying steadily. The older woman with silver hair who was watching Maria's children spoke up. Her voice was not loud but it cut through the noise of the cabin the way certain voices do when they carry genuine authority. "That woman is a decorated combat pilot," she said. "She has flown 267 combat missions. She took shrapnel from a missile and flew her aircraft home. She works 2 jobs to feed those babies and she flies Spirit Airlines because it is the only airline she can afford and she sits in the last row because those are the cheapest seats on the plane. And not one single person on this flight showed her one moment of ordinary human kindness. That man there told her to try harder when her 6-year-old boy was kicking his seat. Those girls told her she should not have flown if she could not afford a babysitter. And right now that woman in her Target shirt and her Walmart shoes is the only reason any of us has a chance of going home tonight. So I suggest everybody sit down and be quiet and let her work." The cabin was very quiet after that. The kind of quiet that has shame in it. Passengers stared at the seat backs in front of them. Nobody spoke. Miguel had woken up and was sitting beside the older woman, pressed against the window, looking down the aisle toward the cockpit door. He knew his mother was up there. His face was serious in the way of a child who is trying very hard to be brave because being brave is what the situation requires. In the cockpit, Maria was hand-flying the approach. Colonel Wright had been guiding her through the descent, through the configuration changes, through the course corrections. The runway lights of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport were visible ahead through the windscreen now, a line of white and blue lights in the dark, and they were real and they were close and they were the most beautiful thing Maria had ever seen. Emergency vehicles were already positioned on both sides of the runway, their lights flashing red and blue and white. The radio traffic on the approach frequency was cleared for them. Every other aircraft in the Atlanta approach environment had been vectored away. The sky was theirs. 1,000 feet, Colonel Wright said on the radio. "You are on glide slope. Airspeed is good. You are doing everything right, Captain." Maria did not answer. She was entirely focused. Her eyes moved from the attitude indicator to the airspeed indicator to the runway ahead and back again in the continuous scanning rhythm that every pilot learns and that Maria had not done in 15 years but that her hands and eyes remembered as if it had been yesterday. The aircraft descended. The runway grew larger in the windscreen. 500 feet, Colonel Wright said. "Looking good. Gear confirmed down. Flaps in position. You have a visual on the runway." "I have a visual," Maria said. Her voice was completely level. 200 feet, the colonel said. "You are doing great, Captain. Just as we discussed. The runway is right there. Bring it home." The altimeter counted down. The runway filled the windscreen. Maria felt the aircraft descend through the last few hundred feet of altitude and she thought for a single half-second about Miguel in the last row pressing himself against the window trying to be brave, and Isabella asleep in the arms of a stranger, and her mother gone now, and all the years she had been invisible and tired and poor, and none of it was the thing that mattered right now. The thing that mattered right now was 178 people and a runway and the knowledge she had earned over 8 years and 267 missions. She was Venom. She had always been Venom. 100 feet, Colonel Wright said. 50 feet. "Flare now, Captain." Maria pulled back gently on the side stick. Gently. The right amount. The nose of the A320 came up the correct number of degrees. The descent rate slowed. The main landing gear touched the runway. Both main wheels at the same time. Smooth. It was a smooth landing, smooth the way a landing is smooth when it is done right, when the aircraft arrives at the runway with the right speed and the right attitude and the right rate of descent and the pilot gives exactly the right input at exactly the right moment. The aircraft rolled out down the runway. The nose wheel came down. Maria deployed the thrust reversers and applied the brakes in a steady controlled manner and the aircraft slowed and turned off the runway and stopped. The emergency vehicles were moving toward them immediately. Maria sat in the captain's seat with her hands still on the controls for a moment. Then she let go. She sat back. She looked at the runway ahead of her through the windscreen, now with the aircraft stopped and still, the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles painting the cockpit in pulses of red and blue. Her hands were shaking now. Not during. Now. She pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed. Colonel Wright's voice came over the radio. "Captain Santos," he said, and his voice was different now, the professional steadiness still there but something else underneath it, something that might have been emotion. "Outstanding job. You just brought 178 people home safely. Venom is back." Maria closed her eyes for 1 second. When she opened them they were bright. "Thank you, Colonel," she said. "I had good help." There was a pause. "No, Captain," the colonel said. "You had a controller and a retired pilot on the radio. Everything else was you. The Air Force trained you. You executed. That is how it works. You never stopped being one of us. You never stopped being a pilot. Welcome home, Venom." Maria held the transmit button for a moment without saying anything. Then she said, quietly, "Thank you, sir." She released the button. She sat in the cockpit for another 30 seconds, alone except for the unconscious pilots and the doctor who was monitoring them, and then she stood up and walked out of the cockpit. The cabin was standing. Everyone who was physically able to stand was standing. They were applauding. Not the polite scattered applause of a normal flight arrival. This was real applause, loud and kept going, the kind that comes from relief so deep it finds its way out as sound because there is nowhere else for it to go. Passengers were crying. The older woman with silver hair had both hands pressed to her face. The college girls in row 29 were standing with tears running down their faces. Miguel had climbed up to stand on his seat and he was clapping with the fierce total commitment of a 6-year-old boy who is proud of his mother. The businessman in seat 30E was standing too. When Maria walked down the aisle he stepped out into the aisle and blocked her path. He was not a small man and he had not looked small all flight, in his expensive suit with his important earphones. He looked small now. His face was wet. He had been crying, genuinely crying, the kind of crying that happens when fear goes away all at once and the emotion has to come out somewhere. He stood in the aisle in front of her and he could not quite look her in the face. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was uneven. "I owe you an apology. More than one. I was cruel to you. I made assumptions about who you were and what you were worth and I was completely wrong and you saved my life and I am so sorry." He stopped. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. "You are a hero. I am so sorry." Maria looked at him. She was tired. She was so deeply tired, the bone-deep tiredness of a person who has spent 15 years working harder than most people can imagine and has just done the hardest and most precise thing she has done since she left the Air Force. She looked at the businessman and she felt, for a moment, the complexity of standing in front of someone who was cruel to you and who is now asking for something from you. Then she said, "I didn't do what I just did for you. I did it for my children. Because they deserve a mother who comes home tonight. And I did it for the other passengers on this aircraft who never did anything wrong to me. That is why I walked up to that cockpit." She paused. "I hope you have a safe trip home." She stepped past him and walked to the last row. Miguel launched himself off his seat into her arms before she could sit down. She caught him. She held him tight with both arms, pressing her face into his hair. She felt him shaking, or maybe she was the one shaking, or maybe they both were. Then Isabella woke up, roused by the noise and movement, and reached both arms up toward Maria with the simple uncomplicated trust of a 4-year-old who knows where safe is. Maria scooped her up too, both children in her arms at the same time, standing in the last row of the Spirit Airlines A320 in her wrinkled Target shirt with her messy ponytail, and the older woman was watching her with a face full of something quiet and warm and real. "You did good, honey," the older woman said. Maria nodded. She did not trust herself to say anything. The paramedics boarded the aircraft and took Captain Morrison and First Officer Park off on stretchers. Both of them were made stable. Both of them would recover. The food contamination that had affected them had been serious but not fatal, and with medical care they would be fine. The other passengers deplaned slowly, many of them stopping to say something to Maria as they passed the last row. Some of them said thank you. Some of them said they were sorry. Some of them could not say anything and just put their hand on her shoulder for a moment and then moved on. The media found out about it within hours. It spread the way things spread when they touch something that people already feel, when a story makes visible something that was invisible before. Single mother working 2 jobs. Spirit Airlines last row. Cheapest seats on the plane. Both pilots down. 178 lives. An Air Force captain who had been invisible for 15 years stepping forward from the last row and bringing everyone home. The story ran everywhere. Newspapers and television news and the internet. Single mom working 2 jobs saves 178 lives on Spirit Airlines flight. The video that Robert Chen had taken on his phone of Maria walking down the aisle toward the cockpit, in her Target shirt and her flip-flops, was watched tens of millions of times. Spirit Airlines called her. They offered her a lifetime pass on their airline, free flights anywhere Spirit flew, for her and her children, for as long as she lived. She thanked them. American Airlines called her 2 days later. They offered her a position as a first officer. Full transition training at their expense. Full benefits from the first day. A starting salary of $75,000 a year, with a clear path forward to captain based on her hours and her record. She would not have to work 2 jobs anymore. She would not have to count every dollar. She could be home with her children at a reasonable hour. She said she needed a night to think about it. She called back the next morning and said yes. A letter arrived from the office of the Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force. It was addressed to Captain Maria Santos. It read, Captain Santos. Once an airman, always an airman. Your actions on August 9, 2020 reflect the highest traditions of military service and the finest qualities of the men and women who have served in the United States Air Force. You demonstrated the skills, the courage, and the judgment that made you one of the finest pilots this service has produced. We are honored to call you one of ours. We are proud of you. Welcome home, Venom. When reporters asked her about the flight, Maria gave answers that were simple and direct and did not try to make herself sound like a hero. But one answer, given in a brief interview outside her apartment building in Detroit on a gray Wednesday morning with both children beside her and her hospital cafeteria uniform on because she still had a morning shift to finish out the week, was recorded and shared more than any other thing she said. The reporter asked her what had gone through her mind when both pilots went down and she realized what she had to do. Maria thought about it for a moment. She said, "For 15 years I have been invisible. The single mom in the last row. The woman in the cheap clothes with the loud kids. When you are poor and struggling, people make assumptions about you. They see what you're wearing and what you can't afford and they decide they already know who you are. They decide you are worth less. They laugh. And for a long time I believed them, a little bit. I thought Venom was someone I used to be. I thought that part of me was gone because I couldn't afford to keep being her." She paused. She looked at Miguel, who was holding her hand and watching her with serious eyes. "But when those pilots collapsed, I had a choice. I could let all those people die, including the people who had been cruel to me and made me feel like nothing, or I could remember who I actually am. Not who they decided I was. Who I actually am. And who I actually am is a fighter pilot. I am Venom. That does not change because I am broke. It does not change because I work minimum wage. It does not change because people do not see me. My circumstances are not my identity. What people think of me is not my identity. She looked back at the reporter. I saved those people because that is what pilots do. We bring people home. All of them. Even the ones who were unkind. Even the ones who laughed. Because the decision to help somebody does not depend on whether they deserve it. It depends on what kind of person you are. I am a fighter pilot. I am a mother. I am a combat veteran who cleans offices and serves food because that is what I have to do right now to keep my children fed. I am Venom in a Target t-shirt. I am all of those things at the same time. None of them cancel each other out. She picked Isabella up, settling her on her hip, and took Miguel's hand again. My children need to know that your circumstances do not define you, she said. How people treat you does not define you. Where you sit on the airplane does not define you. You define you. I sat in the last row. I always sat in the last row because I could not afford anything else. But I was still Venom. I was Venom the whole time. I was just the only one who didn't know it anymore. She looked at the camera for a moment and then she looked down at her children. We have to go, she said. I still have a shift. She walked back inside with her children, in her hospital cafeteria uniform, and the door closed behind her, and the reporter stood on the sidewalk outside a Detroit apartment building on a gray Wednesday morning and did not say anything for a long moment. There was nothing to add. Some stories do not need a final word from the reporter. Some stories say everything they need to say entirely on their own terms, in the words of the person who lived them, and any addition would only be a taking away. This was one of those stories. A fighter pilot walked away from the camera with her children and went back to her life, and the morning continued around her, gray and ordinary and completely unchanged by the amazing thing that had happened inside it, and she was fine with that. She had always been fine with that. Ordinary was where she lived. Ordinary was where she had always done her best work. The sky did not care whether you were flying an F-16 or a commercial airliner or whether you were wearing a flight suit or a Target t-shirt. The sky was the sky. The work was the work. She was Venom. She had always been Venom. And now, finally, after 15 years, everybody knew it too. The morning after the flight, before the media calls started and before anybody outside of Atlanta knew what had happened, Maria sat in the hotel room that Spirit Airlines had arranged for her and her children at the airport, and she could not sleep. Isabella was curled up in the middle of the bed. Miguel was on the other side of her, his small chest rising and falling. The room was quiet and dark except for the light coming under the door from the hallway, and Maria sat in the chair by the window with her knees pulled up and the curtain pushed back so she could see the runway lights in the distance. The aircraft were still moving out there. They did not stop. They never stopped. She thought about the cockpit. She thought about the way the instrument panel had looked when she first sat down in the captain's seat, familiar and new to her at the same time, the way a language you have not spoken in many years is familiar and new to her when you suddenly hear it again. She had been afraid. She had not let the fear into her hands or her voice because she had learned long ago that you could be afraid and still act, that fear and action were not mutually only, that the job did not care how you felt about doing it. It only cared whether you did it. She had done it. She thought about Colonel Wright's voice on the radio. The steadiness of it. The way he had explained each step without condescension, treating her as the trained pilot she was rather than as the untrained passenger everyone else had assumed her to be. She thought about the way he had said, "Venom is back," after she had touched down, and how those two words had unlocked something in her chest that she had not known was locked, a door she had thought was sealed for good, and how she had sat in the cockpit alone for 30 seconds after he said it, just breathing, because she needed 30 seconds to understand what it meant that the door was open again. She thought about Miguel's face when she had walked back to the last row after the landing, the way he had launched himself into her arms with no hesitation, no reservation, just total trust and total relief, the faith of a child who knew that when his mother said she would come back she would come back. She pressed her face against the curtain for a moment and breathed. She was so grateful. She was grateful for the colonel and for Robert Chen and for the older woman Eleanor and for the runway lights and for the mechanics of the aircraft that had held together while she figured out how to fly it. She was grateful for her hands that remembered what her mind had half forgotten. She was grateful for her children asleep in the bed. She pulled the curtain back a little further and looked at the runway lights for a long time. Out there, somewhere in the dark, aircraft were lifting off and setting down with absolute order, one after another, the whole enormous machinery of aviation continuing without pause. There was something comforting about that. The world had not stopped. The sky was still the sky. She was still Venom. She had always been Venom. She pulled the curtain closed, got up from the chair, and lay down on the bed beside her children. She was asleep within 2 minutes. The NTSB investigation into the incident determined that both pilots had been affected by a food contamination in a pre-packaged meal supplied by the airline's catering contractor. The contamination was a bacterial toxin that caused rapid onset of the symptoms both pilots had experienced. The catering contractor was cited for multiple violations. Spirit Airlines overhauled its pre-flight meal protocols for crew. Captain Morrison recovered fully and returned to flying duty 5 months later. First Officer Lisa Park recovered as well, though she took a longer leave of absence before returning. When she returned, she flew the Detroit route several times, and she always stopped to look at the last row before she took her seat in the cockpit. The Air Force had its own private response to what Maria had done. It was not announced publicly. Several senior officers who had served with Maria or who had heard of her during her time in service reached out through private channels in the days following the incident. Some of them called. Some sent letters. One of them, a retired brigadier general who had been at the same base in Germany where Maria had served in 2010, simply sent a message through a mutual contact that said, "We always knew. We just didn't know you were still out there being Venom." Maria read it and put it with the other letters in the box where she kept important things. The college girls from row 29 also reached out. They found Maria through social media, which was not difficult given that her face was on every news channel in the country that week. One of them sent a long message that went through several drafts before she sent it, judging by the way it was written, a message that started 3 different ways before settling into honesty. She said she had watched the news coverage with her mother, who had looked at her daughter during the interview and asked if she had been one of the passengers on that flight. The girl had said yes. Her mother had not said anything else for a while. Then she had said, "I hope you learned something from this." The girl said she had. She was not sure yet what exactly she had learned, only that she felt different than she had before. She did not ask for anything. She did not ask Maria to forgive her or respond. She just said what she had seen and what she felt and sent it. Maria read it and thought about it for a while. She thought about how young 20 years old was. She thought about who she herself had been at 20, 3 years before her first deployment, before the mountains of Afghanistan and the moment over a valley when she had to decide who she was going to be. She wrote back a short reply. She said, "Learning something is all any of us can do." She meant it. In the weeks that followed, many things changed for Maria Santos and many things stayed the same. She started her training with American Airlines. She learned the aircraft types she would be flying, absorbed the procedures and systems and regulations of commercial aviation, and she was good at it, as good as her instructors had expected from someone with her military background and as good as she had quietly expected from herself. The work was not as different as she had feared. The basics were the same. She was still Venom. She had always been Venom. The mortgage on her apartment got easier to manage. The children ate better. Isabella started at a better daycare. Miguel joined a soccer league and Maria could afford the registration fee without having to move money around for 2 weeks. The businessman from seat 30E sent a letter to her through Spirit Airlines. He did not ask for anything. He said he had been thinking about the flight every day since it happened and about the assumptions he had made and the way he had spoken to her. He said he had a 6-year-old daughter of his own. He said he had been trying to be a different kind of person since August 9th and he did not know if he was succeeding, but he was trying. He said he was sorry again and he did not expect her to respond and he just needed her to know. Maria read the letter twice and then put it away in a box where she kept important things. The older woman with silver hair sent a card. Her name was Eleanor. She had been flying to Detroit to visit her grandchildren. She enclosed a photo she had taken on her phone of Maria walking up the aisle of the aircraft toward the cockpit. In the photo, Maria's back was to the camera. She was walking away from the last row, through the middle of the aircraft, in her wrinkled Target shirt and her flip-flops, with her hair still in its ponytail. She looked small in the wide aisle, surrounded by the faces of passengers watching her pass. She looked like nothing special. She looked like a tired woman in cheap clothes. She looked like exactly what she was, a fighter pilot walking toward a cockpit. Eleanor had written on the back of the photo, "For your children, so they always know who their mother is." Maria had it framed. She put it on the wall in the hallway of her apartment where they all walked past it every morning, where Miguel and Isabella would see it every day growing up, the picture of their mother walking toward the front of the aircraft, small and tired and invisible and completely unstoppable. It hung there between a drawing Miguel had made of an airplane and a school photo of Isabella grinning with 2 front teeth missing. It hung there and Maria walked past it every morning on her way to work, first to the hospital cafeteria for the last weeks of that job and then to the airport and then to whatever runway was next and whatever sky was waiting. She walked past it every single morning and some mornings she stopped and looked at it for a moment and some mornings she did not need to. Either way, she knew. She had always known. She was Captain Maria Santos. She was Venom. She was a mother and a veteran and a woman who sat in the last row and got up when it mattered. She was exactly who she was supposed to be. She had been all along.